Welcome to the Event Management Podcast. I'm James Cannell and I'm one of your co-hosts today along with Alan File. Hi, Alan.
Good morning, everyone from Florida. Nice to see you, James. And thank you very much indeed, Vanessa, for agreeing to be our victim this morning. Thank you.
Yeah, we're here with Vanessa. We're here with Vanessa to talk about her new article in Event Management, 23 years of entrepreneurship-related research, published works in event management. Vanessa, maybe you could just kick us off with telling us a little bit about you, what's your role and what are you working on at the moment?
Yeah, hi. I work in Lotto Business School. So my role is Associate Professor Entrepreneurship and Innovation. So I'm looking at events more from an entrepreneurial and innovation perspective. So I came into the research on events and teaching quite a bit later in my career, but realized, really through the COVID pandemic, particularly with tourism, hospitality, and events, that there was a lot of really entrepreneurial things that were occurring. So I read articles about people doing events online through digital technology, and I became really interested in it. So that's kind of the reason for it. And in the article, I'm looking at the past 23 years in terms of events, what kind of different topics have emerged with relation to entrepreneurship. So, thinking about things like innovation, creativity, risk-taking, business ventures, how that is perceived in the events research and different kind of areas that are emerging. So it's kind of more of a relatively recent topic, but it has been in the events research for a long time. But more recently, it's been kind of more evident, that a more entrepreneurial approach to events research is required.
So, Vanessa, is your background entrepreneurship and innovation rather than events per se?
Yeah. So I've been teaching, I do my PhD at the University of Queensland, but it was in business. Okay. But there's a lot of really good scholars in events there. But originally, most of my research was on sport entrepreneurship, sport innovation, looking at emerging economies, and then more recently, I've looked at events because there's a lot of different research gaps within the events research field, and there's a lot of kind of linkages towards entrepreneurship in terms of events having different kind of ecosystems and looking at stakeholder perspectives. So I'm really interested in kind of bridging the research between entrepreneurship and events.
So it was a choice to come to events rather than something that was sort of thrown at you.
Yeah, a really choice. It just kind of happened organically, and I just started reading a lot of articles, and I got kind of interested in some of the mega sport events, that different kind of researchers have written about, and then that kind of got me interested in it. And then I looked at festivals and different kinds of entrepreneurial behavior, particularly through the COVID pandemic, that events, had to do in order to kind of, increase their market share, but also kind of capture, the market during the pandemic.
You're on mute, James.
After all these years, you'd think
we've only been doing this for 4 years.
Exactly. Well, I was just saying, I think it's really interesting. You said you came into events research, mega sports events and these large scale events. It's so often those that capture people's imagination, not just for academics, but for students and for policymakers as well. These kind of big bang events really do help to fire people's imagination up about looking at events in more depth.
Yeah, because you kind of I hadn't thought about it before, but then I kind of read this article and then I got really interested in it. And then I started reading more articles in the journal Event Management. So that then kind of piqued my interest. And then I started doing, research and looking at what had been done and then thinking about, different kind of theories and, different kind of practices, that event managers have. So I think, there's a lot of linkages with the entrepreneurship literature and practice.
Yeah. And so what, you've just got this very broad interest, I think, as an entrepreneurship researcher. It's really interesting looking at your publications. It's clearly something that you can take in lots of different ways. What was it that led you to think about, okay, it's time to write something about, the scope of entrepreneurship research and events?
Yeah, because I've been to like a lot of like farmers markets and like small like community festivals, and then I also kind of looked at a lot of the music events that were occurring like online, that were really innovative, and I did some research particularly during the pandemic with the Melbourne lockdown, in terms of what kind of events were occurring online, and then it just kind of made me more interested in it. And then I thought, oh my God, like it's such a big industry, like it's huge industry and it's got so many kind of ramifications, but it hasn't really been published much in the entrepreneurship field. So I thought that was a really interesting gap, because like previously I'd looked a lot at like sport entrepreneurship, and that was, bridging the sport management and entrepreneurship fields. So I kind of saw an opportunity to do the same thing with events, and also to kind of build new theories that apply, like, looking at entrepreneurial ecosystems and looking at the ecosystem of an event, but also looking at it from a number of different perspectives. So like, event holders, but also the participants. So there's a lot of kind of different areas from it. And kind of my research has been, evolving, looking at like the Melbourne Comedy Festival, and then looking at like entrepreneurial behavior at, comedy festivals. So I've been looking at a number of different, ways of thinking about it. So I think it's a really important area.
So Vanessa, I guess what you said is actually really interesting, because 90% of the people reading your article will be event scholars or tourism or hospitality scholars. In a way, you're introducing them to the world of entrepreneurship and innovation. So where do we go from your work? So I'm reading this thing, wow, this is actually really, really interesting. I'd never thought about this before. What direction would you push people if they want to dig a little bit deeper?
I think they need to look more at the entrepreneurial ecosystem. So entrepreneurial ecosystem, that has been a really popular topic, and it can be used much more in events. So in terms of kind of the theories, a lot of the theories from events are coming from tourism, hospitality, sport. But I think, entrepreneurial ecosystem is a really good way of looking at events. So, looking at the different stakeholders, using that theory. And then also kind of looking at how events evolve and emerge, like, looking at public-private partnerships. So I think that entrepreneurial ecosystem literature is really interesting, but also kind of entrepreneurial behavior, just, how different events are held, particularly like digital and face-to-face and hybrid models. There's a lot of interesting work that can be done with technology entrepreneurship, so looking at technology entrepreneurship, diffusion of innovation, some has been done in events, but I think, some of the new things that are coming through entrepreneurship can also be applied much more in the events context.
It's interesting here, Vanessa. We work with a very, very, well, it's a huge entertainment and event company here in Orlando. They do work all over the States. They were saying that those individuals that are very talented event organizers pre-pandemic are now very different to the people that have adapted to like the virtual world. Yeah. So within the same sort of labor force, they've realized, we've got Group A, our traditional event people, but now we've got these people who were probably quite quiet before, who've really demonstrated sort of entrepreneurship or innovations in a virtual sense. Is that something that you're seeing in the literature?
Yeah, definitely. And also like with artificial intelligence, like augmented reality, virtual reality, and just like, all the digital technology that can track events in different ways, so looking at, forecasting weather, but then also forecasting behavior at events, and then looking at it from, it's just like really interesting, that kind of predictive, technology, and also things like big data, looking at the data analytics of events, and then kind of, trying to predict what's going to happen. So I think it's really interesting, as you said, that digital technology and, utilizing that kind of technology in a different way at events.
Yeah, I think it's really interesting with events. Bringing the social sciences, things that bring them in. Do you think there's scope for events researchers to start writing more about entrepreneurs and to look at the entrepreneurship journals and try and add something there? Yeah. Or is it all about bringing it back into events?
No, I think it's definitely like, because from my research, there's very few articles that I could find that were from like, look, there are some, but not very many. So I think there's a really big opportunity to go from events into the entrepreneurship, more business journals, like industrial marketing, looking at the, marketing, but also, the, traditional entrepreneurship and innovation journals. I think there's a lot of opportunity there because when I've done research on that, there's not that much, but, it's a really kind of interesting area.
And was there anything that came out of your review of the events research in entrepreneurship? Was there anything that came out that you thought, oh, that's really interesting, that's something that entrepreneurship people would be interested in? Is there anything with an events flavour that's jumped out at you?
Yeah, I think like how events are held and organized, so in terms of the behavior, like, specifically like, like music festivals and, in terms of, I think like different contexts, could be studied, like music, comedy festivals, there's not much being done, from that entrepreneurship perspective, but also that ecosystem, how the ecosystem evolves, because there's been some research done on like regional development, regional, economics, but looking more at, the different kind of interplay between the different parties to an event, I think is really interesting.
Yeah, so one of the interesting things here, again, just talking from the perspective in Florida, it was probably about a year ago, we had a special event. It was women leaders in hospitality. And they were 4 female leaders from Disney. So, and they were the leaders of the 4 parks. I'll probably get corrected that there's 5 parks, but I think there's 4. And interesting, it wasn't the fact that they were just women. They were all industrial engineers.
Oh, that's interesting.
And the student body were like, wow, because essentially they're managing mini towns. So I'm just wondering, when you look at the entrepreneurship and an innovation material, do you look at like event curriculum and think, actually, as educators, we should be broadening our scope really to the type of subjects that we should be including?
Yeah, definitely. And I think that also brings up different areas of entrepreneurship too, like women's entrepreneurship and events, diversity, entrepreneurship and events, education and events, and one of the kind of, areas I've also looked at is that education, like entrepreneurial education, to help event managers and planners. But I think, particularly, looking at those different contexts like women entrepreneurs or high tech, startup founders and how they plan events, there's a lot of different areas and interplay between those.
I think it's something as well, I think that's often quite challenging thinking about how we develop our curriculum and what we're teaching to our students. It's often quite challenging for students to get their head around why it's important for them to learn about entrepreneurship and how transferable those skills are to not just starting your own business and being leading and being an innovator, but actually making a contribution and helping firms to be more innovative. I think that's something that students often struggle with.
Yeah, and being an entrepreneurial leader too. How can you be an entrepreneurial leader? So, how can you get people engaged in it? But also from the other hand, also thinking about the events. Being an event manager and being involved, in events. There's a lot of jobs and opportunities for students interested in entrepreneurs. So it can work both ways.
Vanessa, I always ask this question to PhD students in particular. What was the result that you thought, oh, I really wasn't expecting that? What was the surprising outcome of your study?
The surprising outcome
apart from the fact that you're invited to be on a podcast with myself and James today.
I think just like there's a lot of gaps in the literature. Like, when I did the analysis of the studies, there's a lot of stuff done on sport, so most of the emphasis is on sport. But I think the other kind of events, like, they're not so kind of popular or big events, like farmers markets, comedy festivals, different kind of, there's, research on arts, but I found it interesting that there's a gap in terms of like, the diversity of events and the type of events studied. So I think there's, a lot more room, for research, regarding different types of events in terms of entrepreneurial behavior.
I think that's really interesting because I think that speaks to how the events field has developed and how a lot of people have come in through and maybe bringing in people from, bringing people into the field from other business subjects, from different, maybe people who don't have a sectoral focus, but come at it from a particular theoretical, conceptual, but informed angle. We've increased the diversity of events that I think are being looked at.
Yeah.
you're interested in different things. It's not all the mega events and the sports events. I think that's definitely some of the field needs to go as a whole.
Yeah.
So what?
Vanessa, I don't know if you're a member of TriNet. There's a very, very interesting debate on TriNet at the moment, which it could be controversial or not, depending on one's view. But it's very much the world of metrics. And my view is, that's the world we're in. It is what it is, but it doesn't have to dominate everything. What would your advice be to a PhD student who's sort of coming into this metric world? But there is another world out there as well. So a PhD advice or early career researcher, but what would be your take and the little gems or nuggets of advice for the future?
Just focus on what you believe to be a good research topic. So particularly PhD students, they have a new perspective and they'll scan the literature, and they'll often look at it in different ways. So I think it's just kind of believe in themselves and their intuition about what is a good research gap, because they've got that freshness, that they've got a newness coming in. So I think it's exciting, but they have to kind of believe in what they're doing and also realize they might have some failures or rejections, but just to kind of keep on going, and to persevere and to build their research stream. So I think they really kind of just need to persevere, but also kind of link their research to the existing literature, but kind of emphasize their gap in what they're doing that's new.
I think that's really important. I think that the newness and it has to come from the new people who are coming into the field. I think, and that sense of dealing with the pushbacks and the rejections and perseverance, I think is a really good word. You're saying that I saw a tweet the other day, and or an X or whatever it's called now, and it was someone saying academia is basically a series of rejections with the occasional nice lunch, which I thought sums up
basically sums up my life. There's not many lunches at the moment, James. Not this year.
No. But that sense of newness and new ideas, and I think that's one of the things that I found really exciting about reading your paper. Is here's somebody saying that it's not just that there's a body of research and here's all the directions we could go next. Actually, what next, and hopefully there are people coming through thinking about their PhDs or developing their careers in their first post who read review articles like this, especially yours, and think, okay, I could do something like that. There's also been a bit of a conversation recently about review articles and systematic literature reviews, bibliometric literature reviews. Yours is more of a kind of thematic, conceptual review. What do you think about the value of these kind of papers? Obviously, your paper is incredibly valuable, but in general for the field, what do you think papers like yours can add?
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. There's been a lot of emphasis, in the last 5 years, on systematic literature reviews, and there's journals focused on reviews and bibliometrics, and I've done quite a lot of reviews and bibliometrics. But at the same time, I think we also need to build theory. We also kind of need to go back and looking at new theories, because the theory will be the big contribution. And if you can have a foundation, an entrepreneurial theory of events, or there's that will have a lot of value too. So I think the review papers are really good in terms of looking at what's being done, but I think we also need to build that conceptualness and new theories, applying new kind of conceptual models to events, because there's a lot of kind of opportunities to build those new theories, particularly in events. The research has increased a lot, but you need those foundational, the theoretical frameworks, in which to then analyze events. But I think initially new PhD students might do, or other researchers might do a review, but I think, we also need to have those theory papers, so as review papers have become kind of standard and accepted, but I think we need to also go back to the theory papers.
And I think it's something to credit to Mike when he took on the leadership of event management. That's something that Mike has really pushed very, very hard and successfully. We see the papers coming through, and there's a noticeable difference. in terms of the connection to theory and contribution. And I guess on that note, Vanessa, is there any one or two articles that you've read in event management that you thought, wow, obviously apart from my and James's papers, are there any papers that you've seen that have really sort of sowed a seed for future ideas or the catalyst for something a little bit different?
The one that really stood out was Getz's paper about innovation and crises. Like, it was a short paper, but Getz is really well known, and it was like a short paper, but it was really kind of succinct, and I think that paper was like on a really good point. And there was another paper in the special journal issue that I did on social entrepreneurship and events, looking at the educational sector from events, and that was looking at it from an education perspective, what universities are doing with regards to events and how that can be managed entrepreneurial. So, looking at the institutional entrepreneurship, that can occur at events too, I think was really interesting, and a different way of looking at events, because often you don't think about like universities or educational institutions, like that institutional setting. So I think that brings in another new way of looking at entrepreneurship, like institutional entrepreneurship at events, is a different, really kind of interesting way. But I think there's a lot of kind of new areas, coming in, and a lot of really interesting articles.
It's interesting you mentioned Don Getz. I've known Don for years and years and years, and it's interesting his early framing of the subject. It's amazing how accurate it was. Right, on reflection, when you go back, you're like, wow, the foresight and ability to frame what essentially was an empty space at the time was impressive.
And I was really excited to see that he wrote something on, the COVID crisis. I don't think he called it the COVID crisis, but it was like event innovation and crisis. So it's really exciting when you see like an article like that come out in, the event management journal from someone that, is really well known and cited, and, they're still kind of wanting to contribute to the new,
he doesn't need the citations, but he's still contributing. Fantastic.
And we'll make sure that there's a link to that and a link to your article, of course, in the notes for the show that go up online. So thank you very much, Professor Vanessa Ratten. Thank you for taking the time to talk to us about your research. We're really looking forward to seeing how it's taken forward, not just in the journal, in terms of events research and entrepreneurship generally. Thank you very much.
Thanks very
much, James. Thank you, Vanessa, and thank you, James.
Cool.
Excellent.
And we'll see you next time on the Events Management Podcast. Thank you.
Thanks. Bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.